Ashwood was the kind of town where secrets didn't last long. Nestled between rolling hills and dense pine forests, it was a picturesque New England escape. Neighbors waved from front porches, church bells rang on Sundays, and the streets were dotted with charming colonial houses that whispered of simpler times. For Rebecca Sinclair, Ashwood wasn't just her home, it was her sanctuary, the place where she had poured her soul into building a life filled with love, laughter, and purpose. But even sanctuaries can harbor shadows. Rebecca, at 38, was the epitome of selflessness. A mother of two and the heart of the Sinclair family, she was the kind of woman who found joy in the small things, the sound of her children's laughter, the scent of freshly baked bread in her kitchen, the quiet moments spent tending to her garden. Her neighbors adored her. Friends admired her. But Rebecca's greatest strength was also her greatest flaw, her unwavering devotion to those she loved. Her husband, David Sinclair, was equally admired in Ashwood. At 40, he was a respected real estate agent with an easy charm that endeared him to clients and neighbors alike. Together, they seemed the perfect couple, their modest colonial home a beacon of stability and warmth. Yet behind the neatly painted shutters and the blooming flower beds, Rebecca's world was quietly unraveling. David had always been a man of ambition, a quality Rebecca had admired when they were just teenagers. They had married young, right after high school, in fact, against the cautious advice of friends and family. Rebecca's mother, Martha Johnson, had been the most vocal critic. A widow with a sharp tongue and high expectations, Martha believed Rebecca deserved more than a hasty marriage to a man who had little to his name but big dreams. But Rebecca was resolute. She saw in David a future worth fighting for, a man who would rise above his humble beginnings with her by his side. And rise he did. David built his career step by step, fueled by Rebecca's unwavering support. While he attended real estate school in Portland, she took on multiple jobs to keep their household afloat. She gave up her dream of becoming a teacher, telling herself it was a small price to pay for the life they were building together. Over the years, Rebecca's sacrifices bore fruit. David's name became synonymous with success in Ashwood, and their children flourished under Rebecca's attentive care. But even the strongest foundations can crack under pressure. As March arrived and the first hints of spring touched Ashwood, Rebecca felt an unease she couldn't quite place. Her marriage, once filled with passion and partnership, had become distant. David often came home late, his once warm demeanor replaced by a strained smile and vague excuses about work. And then there was her mother, Martha, who had started spending more time at their house under the guise of helping Rebecca with the children. Rebecca tried to dismiss the tension between them as a product of her imagination. After all, David and Martha were the two people she trusted most. Yet something felt wrong. Rebecca's instincts, honed by years of quietly observing those she loved, told her there was a storm on the horizon. But for now, she pushed her doubts aside, unaware that the perfect world she had so carefully built was about to collapse in ways she could never have imagined. Rebecca's life had always been a story of quiet sacrifices. From a young age, she had learned to put others first, a lesson drilled into her by her mother, Martha Johnson. As the daughter of a sharp-witted, often demanding woman, Rebecca grew up believing her worth lay in how much she could give. Martha, a widow who had built her life around high expectations, often reminded Rebecca that strength wasn't about chasing dreams but ensuring the stability of those around you. And so, Rebecca became the dependable one, the peacemaker, the caregiver, the selfless daughter who would never let anyone down. That selflessness defined Rebecca's adult life as well. When she met David Sinclair in high school, she saw in him a kindred spirit. David was ambitious, yes, but there was a vulnerability in him that called out to her. Raised in a working-class family, David often spoke about wanting to escape his circumstances, to build a better future for himself and those he loved. Rebecca admired that drive, and by the time they graduated, she was certain he was the one she wanted to spend her life with. Their marriage, however, wasn't without challenges. Martha had been vocal in her disapproval, questioning David's ability to provide for her daughter. "He's charming," Martha had said on more than one occasion, "but charm doesn't pay the bills." Rebecca, though, was determined. She believed in David and in the life they could build together, even if it meant starting with nothing. In the early years of their marriage, Rebecca's belief was put to the test. David enrolled in a real estate program in Portland, a decision that strained their finances to the breaking point. Rebecca worked long hours at a diner and took up a part-time job at a local grocery store to cover their expenses. Her own dream of becoming a teacher, a goal she had held onto since childhood, was quietly set aside. There will be time for that later, she would tell herself, though deep down, she wasn't sure she believed it. Despite the hardships, Rebecca found joy in the little victories. When David graduated and secured his first job at a real estate agency, it felt like a shared triumph. Over time, his career flourished, and their modest home in Ashwood became a symbol of what they had built together. It wasn't the grand life Rebecca had once envisioned, but it was enough. More than enough, she reminded herself. As their family grew, Rebecca's sacrifices only deepened. Their 2 children became the center of her world, and she poured everything into creating a loving, stable home. She was the one who stayed up late sewing Halloween costumes, the one who turned rainy days into baking adventures, the one who cheered the loudest at soccer games. David's career often kept him busy, and Rebecca accepted that as the price of their success. She never complained when he missed family dinners or when his phone buzzed with late-night work calls. She had made her peace with her role, the glue that held it all together. But beneath her unwavering devotion lay an unspoken loneliness. While David's ambition propelled him forward, Rebecca remained tethered to the life they had built. The dreams she had once harbored, to teach, to travel, to explore beyond the confines of Ashwood, had faded into the background. She told herself it was worth it, that the happiness of her family was more important than her own. And yet, there were moments when she couldn't ignore the nagging thought, was this enough? Did anyone truly see how much she had given? Rebecca's sacrifices hadn't gone unnoticed, at least not by those in the community. In Ashwood, she was a pillar of kindness and reliability. Neighbors would often drop by for advice or to borrow a cup of sugar, knowing Rebecca would never turn them away. The women at the church admired her, though some whispered about the toll her selflessness must have taken. "She's a saint," they would say. But saints aren't meant to bear so much alone. Even Martha, with all her sharp edges, occasionally acknowledged her daughter's quiet strength. "You've done well," she had told Rebecca once, during a rare moment of vulnerability. But the words rang hollow, a mere acknowledgement of what Rebecca already knew, that she had spent her life ensuring everyone else's needs were met while burying her own. And so, as March turned to April, Rebecca found herself clinging to the life she had built with David. It wasn't perfect, but it was hers. What she didn't realize was that the very foundation she had sacrificed so much to build was already beginning to crack. The weight of her sacrifices, coupled with the betrayal she had yet to uncover, was about to bring everything crashing down. The day Rebecca Sinclair's life changed forever began like any other. The sun peeked through the lace curtains of her modest colonial home, casting a warm glow over the kitchen where she was pouring cereal for her youngest. Outside, the familiar sound of Ashwood's morning bustle drifted through the open window, neighbors exchanging greetings, the hum of cars heading toward Portland. It was a morning like countless others. But by afternoon, everything she had carefully built would begin to slip through her fingers. Rebecca had been feeling off for months. Exhaustion clung to her like a second skin, more oppressive than the usual weariness that came from managing a household. She'd dismissed it at first, chalking it up to the endless demands of being a wife, mother, and homemaker. But the weight loss was harder to ignore, as were the sharp, fleeting pains that had begun to creep into her chest and back. It was David who finally convinced her to see a doctor, brushing off her protests about the cost with a rare insistence. "It's probably nothing," he had said, his tone more hopeful than certain. "But you need to get it checked out." By the time Rebecca arrived at the Portland hospital for her appointment, her nerves had settled into a quiet resignation. She wasn't prepared for what the doctor would tell her. No one ever is. The words came gently but hit like a hammer: stage 4 cancer. Terminal. Months left, not years. The drive back to Ashwood was a blur. David, who had accompanied her, gripped the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. The weight of the diagnosis settled between them like a silent third passenger. Rebecca sat in stunned silence, her mind racing through an endless loop of questions. How do I tell the kids? What will happen to them? To David? To us? Her chest tightened, not from the disease eating away at her body, but from the realization that she would not be there to see her children grow, to protect them, to hold them through life's inevitable storms. David was the first to break the silence, though his words did little to comfort her. "We'll get through this," he said, his voice trembling. "We have to." But the way he gripped the wheel, the way his gaze stayed fixed on the road, told Rebecca he was barely holding it together. That night, she watched him retreat into himself, his usual warmth replaced by a kind of desperate distraction. He didn't sit with her in the kitchen like he usually did after the kids went to bed. Instead, he disappeared into his office, the door closing softly behind him. It was the first crack in their fragile foundation. As Rebecca's condition worsened over the following weeks, so too did the distance between her and David. He began staying later at work, claiming the distraction helped him cope. When he was home, his attention seemed to be elsewhere. Rebecca tried to give him grace. She told herself he was grieving in his own way, processing the inevitable loss of the woman who had stood by his side for so many years. But she couldn't ignore the sense of isolation growing in the spaces he left behind. Amidst her own grief, Rebecca found an unexpected source of support in her mother, Martha. The older woman had taken the diagnosis hard but quickly shifted into action, moving into the Sinclair household under the pretense of helping with the children and household tasks. At first, Rebecca was grateful for her mother's presence. Martha's ability to take charge, to organize chaos, was a relief. But over time, something about her presence began to unsettle Rebecca. It wasn't the way Martha rearranged the kitchen cabinets or took over bedtime routines, it was the subtle shift in her relationship with David. Rebecca noticed it in small, almost imperceptible ways. The quiet conversations between the two in the kitchen after the kids were in bed. The way David seemed more at ease when Martha was around. The fleeting but intense glances they exchanged, as if sharing some unspoken understanding. At first, Rebecca dismissed these thoughts as paranoia born of her illness and exhaustion. They're just supporting each other, she told herself. They're both grieving in their own way. But as the days turned into weeks, the cracks in Rebecca's perfect world widened. David's absence became more pronounced, his late nights more frequent. Martha's presence, once comforting, now felt overbearing, even invasive. Rebecca found herself watching them more closely, searching for signs that her intuition was wrong, that the growing distance she felt wasn't real. One evening, as Rebecca lay awake in bed, too weak to join the family downstairs, she overheard muffled voices drifting up from the kitchen. David's deep timbre mixed with Martha's softer tones, the sound carrying an intimacy that felt wrong. She strained to hear the words, but the meaning was clear in the silences that followed. Her heart ached with a new kind of pain, one that had nothing to do with her failing body. Rebecca didn't have proof. Not yet. But as she stared at the ceiling that night, she couldn't shake the feeling that the people she trusted most were hiding something from her. Something that would shatter her already fragile world. For the first time since her diagnosis, Rebecca felt a spark of anger flicker inside her, a spark she would soon learn to feed. It began with late-night conversations, the kind that might seem innocent at first glance. David Sinclair and Martha Johnson often found themselves alone in the quiet of the Sinclair kitchen after the rest of the house had gone to bed. Rebecca, too weak to join them, would lie in her bedroom, listening to the faint murmur of their voices drifting up the stairs. She told herself there was nothing unusual about it. After all, Martha was her mother, and David was her husband. They were grieving, just as she was, and supporting each other through the unthinkable. But the intimacy of their connection soon became impossible to ignore. David had always admired Martha's strength, though he had rarely said so aloud. She was a woman who commanded respect, who had survived her husband's untimely death and emerged sharper, more determined. In Martha, David found a reflection of the stability and resilience he had once relied on Rebecca to provide. As Rebecca's illness consumed her energy, Martha stepped seamlessly into the role of caretaker, not just for Rebecca, but for the entire household. She cooked, cleaned, and tended to the children with a quiet efficiency that David found both comforting and compelling. At first, their late-night talks revolved around Rebecca. They shared memories of her, discussed her treatment plan, and grappled with the looming reality of her death. But as the weeks passed, the tone of their conversations shifted. They began to talk about their own fears, their own pain. David confided in Martha in ways he hadn't with Rebecca, admitting his feelings of helplessness and guilt. Martha, in turn, revealed vulnerabilities Rebecca had never seen in her mother, a deep loneliness that had haunted her since her husband's passing. The boundary between mother-in-law and son-in-law blurred in those quiet moments. Martha's touch lingered a little too long on David's shoulder. David's gaze held hers a little too intensely. The grief they shared became a bond, and that bond deepened into something darker. The first crack came one evening in late May. Rebecca had managed to muster enough energy to join the family for dinner, but she noticed the way David and Martha avoided her eyes. Their banter, once so natural, felt strained, as if they were walking on eggshells. Later that night, as she lay in bed, Rebecca heard laughter from downstairs. It wasn't the kind of laughter born from joy, it was soft, intimate, and private, like a secret shared between two people. Her stomach churned, though she told herself she was imagining things. But the signs continued to pile up. The whispered conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered the room. The way Martha would linger near David, her hand brushing his arm in a way that felt too familiar. The glances exchanged between them, fleeting but charged with an unspoken tension. Rebecca began to feel like an outsider in her own home, the warmth she had once felt replaced by a growing sense of unease. The tipping point came on a warm June evening. David had left his phone on the kitchen counter while he helped Martha carry groceries inside. Rebecca, alone in the house, noticed the device buzz with a notification. It was a text message, and though she hesitated, something compelled her to look. The message was from Martha. "I can't stop thinking about last night. We need to be more careful." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. Her hands trembled as she set the phone back down, careful not to leave any trace of her discovery. She felt her heart pounding in her chest, the world narrowing as her worst fears solidified into reality. Her husband, the man she had devoted her life to, and her mother, the woman who had raised her, were betraying her in the most unimaginable way. Rebecca didn't confront them, not yet. She needed more than a single text message. She needed proof, not for herself, but for the reckoning she was beginning to plan. Her grief began to transform into something else entirely, a simmering rage that she struggled to contain. But even in her anger, she was calculating. She knew that if she acted too soon, they would find a way to deny it, to cover their tracks. She couldn't allow that. This betrayal was too deep, too profound to go unanswered. For the next few days, Rebecca observed them more closely than ever. She noted every touch, every glance, every whispered word. She began to piece together a timeline in her mind, the puzzle of their betrayal slowly coming into focus. She felt like a ghost in her own home, haunting the spaces they thought were safe. And though the knowledge of their infidelity burned inside her, she forced herself to stay silent. She needed them to believe she was oblivious. She needed them to let their guard down. Because when Rebecca Sinclair finally acted, it would not be impulsive. It would be deliberate. And it would be devastating. Rebecca Sinclair had always been a woman who chose love over conflict, understanding over confrontation. But the betrayal she had uncovered, so sharp and searing, ignited something deep within her, something unrecognizable. It wasn't just anger, it was a hunger for justice, for reckoning. And if she had learned anything from her years of sacrifice, it was that patience was a virtue. This time, however, her patience would serve a darker purpose. For days after reading that damning text message, Rebecca maintained a facade of calm. She continued her routine as best she could, despite the physical toll of her illness. She smiled at David when he brought her tea, thanked Martha for folding the children's laundry, and pretended not to notice when their stolen glances lingered a little too long. Every interaction, every kind word she offered them, was calculated, a part of the mask she wore to keep them unsuspecting. Rebecca's first move was simple but effective. She began documenting everything. Late one night, after David had gone to bed, she retrieved his phone from the nightstand. She scrolled through his messages with Martha, screenshotting anything that hinted at their relationship. Phrases like, "I don't know how much longer I can keep this secret," and "being with you feels like the only escape," filled her with a mix of rage and grim satisfaction. She forwarded the evidence to her email, carefully deleting the traces of her activity before returning the phone to its place. But text messages alone wouldn't be enough. Rebecca needed more. Over the next week, she kept a notebook hidden beneath her mattress, jotting down the times David came home late, the hushed conversations in the kitchen, the fleeting touches she observed when they thought no one was watching. Each detail was another piece of ammunition in her growing arsenal. What disturbed Rebecca most wasn't just the betrayal itself, but the audacity with which David and Martha carried on their affair under her roof. There was no shame in their actions, no hesitation. They believed her illness had blinded her, made her weak. They couldn't have been more wrong. Rebecca's illness had stripped away everything but her resolve. Her time was limited, but she would use every moment she had left to ensure they paid for what they had done. The turning point came one evening when Rebecca overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. She had taken to lying awake at night, listening for the soft murmurs that came from the kitchen below. That night, David's voice was laced with desperation as he whispered to Martha, "We can't keep this up. She's going to figure it out." Martha's reply, calm and measured, cut through the darkness, "She's too sick to notice. Besides, we'll have time, after." The implication was clear. They were already planning for a future without her. The weight of their words pressed down on Rebecca, her breathing shallow as she fought to contain the fury threatening to consume her. But it was in that moment that her plan crystallized. If they believed she was too weak to act, she would use that assumption to her advantage. She would make them feel safe, secure, even forgiven, only to pull the rug out from under them at the moment they least expected. Rebecca began to sow the seeds of her revenge. She reached out to an old friend, Claire Bennett, who worked as a lawyer in Portland. Under the guise of seeking legal advice about her will, Rebecca subtly shifted the conversation toward infidelity laws in Maine. Claire, unaware of Rebecca's true intent, explained how damning evidence of an affair could influence divorce settlements and community perceptions, especially in a town as small as Ashwood. Rebecca absorbed every word, her mind working like a machine. Her next step was to orchestrate a confrontation, but not yet. Timing was everything. She needed to catch them in the act, not just for her own closure, but to ensure there would be no room for denial. Rebecca began setting traps, leaving the house at odd hours under the pretense of running errands or visiting the doctor. Each time, she returned earlier than expected, hoping to catch them off guard. While she didn't walk in on anything explicit, the startled expressions on their faces told her enough. They were nervous, but not enough to stop. As the days wore on, Rebecca's outward demeanor grew warmer, even kind. She praised Martha for her help, laughed at David's tired jokes, and spoke fondly of the memories they had shared. It was all part of the act, a way to lull them into a false sense of security. But beneath the surface, Rebecca was calculating every move, every word, every step toward the moment of reckoning. By mid-June, Rebecca had everything she needed: text messages, a timeline, and a simmering determination. But her plan wouldn't be complete without the final act, a confrontation that would destroy the fragile illusion of their perfect family. She began preparing for a dinner, one she would later describe as a celebration of the love we share. It was an invitation neither David or Martha could refuse. What they didn't know was that Rebecca's celebration was not of love, but of justice. And when the truth finally came to light, it would be devastating. The evening of June 30, 2013, was unusually still in Ashwood. The summer air was thick with humidity, wrapping the small town in an oppressive silence. In the Sinclair household, however, the atmosphere was far from quiet. Rebecca Sinclair, with a calm precision that belied the storm raging within her, was putting the finishing touches on what she had called a family dinner. To David and Martha, it seemed like an olive branch, a gesture of love and unity amidst the chaos of Rebecca's illness. But Rebecca knew better. This wasn't a dinner, it was a stage. And tonight, the curtain would rise on the final act of her carefully orchestrated revenge. The dining room was set beautifully. Candles flickered atop the polished oak table, their soft glow reflecting off the neatly arranged plates and silverware. A bouquet of freshly cut hydrangeas sat at the center, their pale blue petals a stark contrast to the darkness that loomed over the evening. The scent of roasted chicken and herbs filled the air, mingling with the faint, sweet aroma of wine. Rebecca moved through the preparations with an almost eerie calm, her every action deliberate, her every thought razor-sharp. David and Martha arrived separately, as if to avoid suspicion, but Rebecca knew better. She greeted each of them with a warm smile, her voice steady, her demeanor serene. To David, she was the loving wife who had finally found peace with her fate. To Martha, she was the grateful daughter who appreciated her mother's unwavering support. Neither of them saw the cracks beneath the surface, the simmering fury Rebecca had contained for weeks. As they sat down to eat, Rebecca played her role perfectly. She asked about David's work, complimented Martha's dress, and reminisced about family vacations from years past. Her laughter was soft and genuine, her gaze steady, never betraying the truth of what she knew. David and Martha, lulled by her warmth, began to relax. They exchanged glances that were almost imperceptible, but Rebecca caught them all. They still believed they had fooled her. The thought both sickened and emboldened her. Halfway through the meal, Rebecca rose from her chair. "I almost forgot," she said, her voice light. "I have something to share with you both." She left the room briefly, returning with a manila envelope in hand. As she sat back down, her expression shifted, the mask of affection slipping away to reveal something colder, sharper. The change was subtle but unmistakable. David straightened in his chair, his fork pausing midway to his mouth. Martha's smile faltered, her eyes narrowing slightly as she studied her daughter's face. Rebecca placed the envelope on the table and slid it toward David. "Open it," she said simply. David hesitated, his hand trembling slightly as he picked it up. Inside were the printed text messages, time-stamped and undeniable. His eyes widened as he flipped through them, the color draining from his face. He didn't need to look at Rebecca to know she had seen everything. "What is this?" Martha's voice broke the silence, but Rebecca cut her off with a glare so icy it froze the words in her throat. "You tell me, Mother," Rebecca said, her tone calm but laced with venom. "Because I've spent weeks trying to understand how the two people I trusted most could betray me like this." Martha's composure cracked, her lips parting as if to protest, but no words came. David sat frozen, his head bowed, the evidence spread before him like a confession laid bare. The silence that followed was suffocating, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the corner. "I gave my life to this family," Rebecca continued, her voice steady despite the tears brimming in her eyes. "I sacrificed everything for you, David. And you, Mother," she turned to Martha, her voice hardening. "You were supposed to protect me, to guide me. Instead, you took what little I had left." David finally spoke, his voice shaky and barely audible. "Rebecca, I didn't mean for this to happen." "No," Rebecca snapped, her anger breaking through. "You didn't mean to get caught." Martha reached for Rebecca's hand, but she pulled away sharply, the gesture rejected as quickly as it was offered. "Don't," Rebecca said coldly. "You don't get to act like the victim here. Neither of you do." The room fell silent again, the weight of Rebecca's words hanging heavy in the air. David and Martha looked at each other, their shared guilt etched across their faces. For the first time, the reality of what they had done seemed to fully sink in. Rebecca stood, her frail body trembling with the effort, but her voice was firm. "I don't have much time left," she said. "But I'll be damned if I let you two walk away from this unscathed. Tomorrow, everyone in Ashwood will know exactly who you are and what you've done." Martha gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. David looked at Rebecca with a mixture of horror and desperation. "Rebecca, please," he pleaded. "Don't do this. Don't ruin us." Rebecca leaned in close, her voice dropping to a whisper. "You already ruined us." She turned and left the room, her footsteps echoing down the hall. Behind her, the once perfect image of her family lay in ruins. The betrayal was exposed, the mask torn away, and the illusion shattered. But Rebecca didn't feel triumphant. There was no satisfaction in this, only the hollow ache of knowing that justice came at the cost of everything she had ever loved. The silence that followed Rebecca's departure from the dining room was deafening. David sat frozen, his face pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table as though it were the only thing keeping him upright. His thoughts scrambled in a haze of guilt, regret, and fear. He had known, deep down, that this day would come. He had known that Rebecca would eventually uncover the truth. But nothing could have prepared him for the coldness in her eyes, the quiet fury that burned beneath her composed exterior. Martha, on the other hand, was a mess of emotions, shock, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of guilt. Her hands trembled as she reached for her wine glass, only to stop mid-motion as the realization settled in, nothing she could say would fix this. Her daughter, the woman she had raised, had caught her in the most unforgivable act. And she could no longer hide behind the mask of a loving mother, of the one who had just been helping. The truth was out, and it was uglier than either of them could have imagined. David and Martha remained at the table in silence for what felt like hours. The once cozy atmosphere of the room now felt like a tomb, suffocating under the weight of their shared betrayal. They had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The following morning, the ripple effects of Rebecca's revelation began to spread throughout Ashwood like wildfire. Word traveled quickly in a small town, and by midday, the entire community knew. Friends, neighbors, and even casual acquaintances who had once admired the Sinclair family for their perfect life, were now whispering behind closed doors. Some offered their sympathy to Rebecca, others to David and Martha, but no one could escape the shame of it all. Rebecca's confrontation had exposed the darkest secret in their lives, and it left a stain that could never be washed away. What was once a family that everyone admired now became a cautionary tale of betrayal, deceit, and the consequences of breaking the trust that bound them together. David, unable to escape the glare of the community's judgment, retreated into himself. He stopped attending social events, withdrew from family gatherings, and began avoiding the very people who had once been his support system. The shame of what he had done, to his wife, to his children, to his entire town, was too much to bear. He felt his reputation crumbling with each passing day, his self-worth eroding under the weight of the truth. He moved out of the family home, unable to face Rebecca in the aftermath of his actions. The house that had once been filled with laughter and love now sat empty, a hollow shell of what it used to be. David tried to reach out to her, but Rebecca remained silent. She had nothing left to say to him. She had already made her decision, and it was clear that there was no place for him in her life anymore. Martha, on the other hand, found herself utterly isolated. The community, once so kind and respectful, now turned its back on her. She became a pariah in Ashwood, her reputation tarnished beyond repair. Neighbors who had once greeted her with warm smiles now avoided her in the street. She had lost not only her daughter's trust but also her place in the community. Her life, once so firmly anchored in family and social connections, was now adrift, and she had nowhere to turn. The worst part of it all was the guilt that gnawed at her day and night. She had not only betrayed her daughter but had also betrayed herself. She had spent years convincing herself that her actions were justified, that she was simply providing comfort in a time of need. But in the cold light of truth, there was no justification. The damage had been done. Meanwhile, Rebecca had retreated into herself, grappling with the complex emotions that came with being both the victim and the one who had exposed the truth. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that her family, the people she had loved and trusted most, had turned on her when she was at her weakest. Her anger had been justified, but now it was mixed with an overwhelming sadness. Her world, which had already been shrinking because of her terminal illness, had grown even smaller. Rebecca didn't feel vindicated, despite the actions she had taken. She had gotten the truth out, and she had ensured that David and Martha would face the consequences of their betrayal. But in the quiet moments when she lay in bed, her body failing her, she couldn't shake the feeling that nothing could heal the wounds left by their deceit. Her children, too young to fully understand the gravity of the situation, would grow up in a broken world, a world she had once worked so hard to protect. The toll of the betrayal on Rebecca's health was undeniable. The stress, the emotional weight of it all, seemed to accelerate her decline. As the days turned into weeks, her condition worsened. The pain in her body intensified, and the once vibrant woman who had given so much to her family now withered before their eyes. Despite her physical deterioration, Rebecca remained resolute. She had made her peace with the fact that her time was limited. But she had also made the painful decision to ensure that David and Martha would live with the consequences of their actions for the rest of their lives. They had taken something from her, her trust, her family, and her dignity, and now they would have to live with the fallout. The ripple effect of Rebecca's revenge was far-reaching. David and Martha may have thought they could escape unscathed, but the truth had a way of catching up with them, no matter how far they ran. And while Rebecca's life was nearing its end, the emotional consequences of their betrayal would linger long after she was gone. The days following Rebecca's confrontation with David and Martha were both a blur and a slow crawl toward an inevitable end. Rebecca had said all she needed to say. She had confronted the betrayal in its rawest form, and the truth had come crashing down around her. But what she didn't realize in those final weeks was that the most significant part of her story, the real lesson, was not in the revenge she had exacted, but in the way she had managed to maintain her dignity, even as everything she had built collapsed. As Rebecca's health declined, she became more introspective, spending long stretches of time staring out the window, watching the seasons shift in Ashwood. There was a stillness in her that hadn't been there before, a peaceful resignation that came from facing the inevitable. She had spent so much of her life worrying about the people she loved, constantly sacrificing her own needs and desires for them. And now, she was left with the bitter knowledge that the people she had trusted most had betrayed her in the cruelest way possible. Yet, despite everything, Rebecca found a quiet strength in knowing that she had taken control of her own narrative. Her plan had been set into motion not for the sake of punishment alone but for the preservation of her own dignity. Rebecca had no illusions about the nature of her illness. She knew her time was short, but she also knew that the moment of truth, the reckoning, was hers to choose. What had truly shattered her, beyond the affair itself, was the thought that David and Martha thought she wouldn't notice, that they could somehow go on living their lives without consequence. The lesson she imparted was a painful one: no matter how much someone may sacrifice for others, no matter how much love they give, betrayal and deceit leave a mark that cannot be erased. As her physical strength waned, Rebecca turned inward, reflecting on her life and the choices that had led her here. She thought about the dreams she had set aside, the life she had once imagined for herself, a life filled with joy and personal fulfillment. She thought about the sacrifices she had made for David, for the children, for everyone except herself. She had believed, like many women in her position, that the best way to love others was to sacrifice her own dreams and desires. But now, lying in the quiet of her home, she understood that such sacrifices, when made at the expense of self-respect, could lead to feelings of emptiness. Rebecca had taught her children that love was about giving, about nurturing and supporting those you care about. She had believed this, wholeheartedly. But in her final months, she had come to understand that true love, the kind that strengthens, does not demand such sacrifices at the cost of one's own self-worth. She could love David and Martha without losing herself, without allowing their actions to define who she was. In her final moments, Rebecca found the strength to forgive herself, for all the years spent in self-doubt, for the choices she had made that had brought her here. She finally understood that forgiveness wasn't something to be given to others, it was something she needed to offer to herself. When word of Rebecca's declining health spread, there were a few who still visited, some who had been her friends, some who had known her from the church or the local community events she had so generously volunteered for in the past. They expressed their sorrow and sadness, but Rebecca never asked for pity. She knew what was happening, and more importantly, she knew that the legacy she would leave behind wasn't just one of pain and betrayal, it was a legacy of strength, of quiet dignity in the face of suffering. She would not be remembered for her illness, nor for the betrayal she had uncovered, but for the way she had conducted herself throughout it all. She would be remembered as a woman who gave everything for her family, and though that love was ultimately betrayed, she still managed to reclaim her own voice. David, too, came to understand this lesson, though much too late. He visited Rebecca in her final days, and it was during one of those visits that he began to truly grasp the weight of his actions. He had been so consumed with guilt and fear, his mind clouded with the enormity of what he had lost, that he hadn't fully comprehended the extent of the pain he had caused. Seeing Rebecca, fragile and frail, yet still holding her head high, was a moment of clarity for him. For the first time, David realized that the true measure of love wasn't in the grand gestures of success or ambition, but in the small acts of kindness, in the quiet moments of trust and respect. He had broken that trust, not once, but repeatedly. And now, he was paying the price. Martha, too, would carry the burden of her actions for the rest of her life. The affair was no longer a secret. The whispers in Ashwood grew louder, and Martha found herself shunned by the very community that had once embraced her. But more than that, she carried the heavy weight of guilt, knowing that her actions had led to the destruction of her daughter's world. She had no excuses, no way to justify her betrayal. Rebecca's quiet strength had left a mark on her that would never fade. Rebecca Sinclair's death, though inevitable, was not a loss to be mourned alone. In her final moments, she had provided a lesson that few could have taught, that betrayal, no matter how deep, does not have to define the course of a life. It was the forgiveness and understanding one found for oneself, the reclamation of dignity in the face of pain, that mattered most. She had spent her life loving others, but in her last days, she learned to love herself, for all her flaws, all her sacrifices, and all her strength. Rebecca's story was not one of vengeance, but of profound human resilience. In the end, it wasn't the revenge that gave her peace, it was the knowledge that she had taken control of her narrative, and in doing so, had taught her family a lesson that would last far beyond her death. The town of Ashwood would never be the same again. In the months following Rebecca's death, the once vibrant community became a place of quiet reflection. The Sinclair family, which had once been a symbol of love, devotion, and success, was now the subject of hushed conversations and divided loyalties. The betrayal that had been exposed in Rebekah's final days haunted everyone involved: David, Martha, and the community that had once admired them. David, unable to escape the weight of his guilt, left Ashwood. The once gleaming real estate empire he had built with Rebekah at his side crumbled. Friends turned their backs on him, and he became a shell of the man he once was. His reputation, tarnished beyond repair, followed him wherever he went. He tried to rebuild his life, but no matter where he went, Rebekah's shadow loomed large. He had betrayed the one person who had given him everything, and in doing so, he had lost more than he could ever regain. Martha, on the other hand, found herself even more isolated. The whispers in Ashwood had grown louder in the wake of Rebekah's passing. No longer could she walk through the streets of the town with the same confidence. Once a respected figure, Martha became a pariah. Friends and family alike refused to speak to her. She retreated into herself, unable to face the damage she had caused. The affair, once hidden beneath a veil of secrecy, was now known to all, and with it, the truth of her betrayal. Her relationship with Rebekah was permanently severed, and her reputation was irrevocably stained. But it was Rebekah's children who would carry the heaviest burden. As the years passed, the memory of their mother's strength became a guiding force in their lives. The betrayal had torn apart their family, but they would grow up understanding the value of honesty, integrity, and the importance of trust. Rebekah had never been perfect, but she had always believed in the power of love, and in the end, her love for her family was undeniable. In her last days, Rebekah had done more than expose the truth of David and Martha's betrayal. She had given her children the greatest gift of all, the ability to see through the lies, to hold their heads high, and to never compromise their integrity for anyone or anything. Rebekah's death, while tragic, was not the end of her influence. Her legacy lived on in her children, who would grow up understanding the painful but powerful lessons of sacrifice, betrayal, and self-respect. Her story became a lesson not only to her family but to the entire town of Ashwood. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, there is strength in the truth. The consequences of betrayal are never fleeting, and the scars they leave are not easily healed. Rebekah Sinclair had given everything for her family, and in the end, her ultimate act of courage was to expose the truth, no matter the cost. As time passed, the people of Ashwood came to understand the true depth of Rebekah's character. They remembered her not just for the sacrifices she had made, but for the way she had reclaimed her voice in her final moments, demanding justice for herself, her children, and her family. Her legacy was not just about the betrayal she had uncovered or the pain she had endured, but the way she had shown those around her the true meaning of love and self-respect. And though the town of Ashwood would never fully heal from the scars left by her death, Rebekah had planted the seeds of understanding, seeds that would grow into something stronger, something wiser. What do you think of Rebekah's story? Do you believe the truth was worth the painful cost she paid? How do you think David and Martha could have made things right? Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with us. If you've ever experienced betrayal, how did you handle it? Would you have taken the same path as Rebekah, or would you have chosen forgiveness instead? Let us know how you would have reacted in her place. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe if you want to hear more thought-provoking stories like this. We'd love to hear your opinion.